Now let us turn our attention to the term positivism. After the natural law, the three phases of natural law, that is the ancient, the medieval, and the Renaissance, a new group of thinkers came in. They opined their views regarding law, and they are called as positivists, or the people who belong to one particular thought. They are categorized in this particular classification. Each school has got different characteristics. So when a jurist comes up with the theory, the characteristics of their theory is seen, and then it is seen the characteristics match which approach, and that jurist is classified into that particular school. This is how the classification is made. So if somebody says, a jurist says that the law is made by God and the basis of law should be religion, then immediately he is put into the natural law group. Suppose somebody says no, the law is made by man, then he is put into the positives. Suppose somebody says no, the law is made by judges, then he is put in realism, like that. But it is not so easy, because what happens is one jurist may speak about 2-3 things. Then the question comes where to put him. Then this part of theory falls in positivism, this part of theory falls in natural law, like that, or functional. It is so it is not very easy to classify. So positivism. So what is the meaning of positivism? Positivism means something which is clear, something which is definite, precise, something which is not ambiguous, vague, very clear. So here the aim, the effort of the jurist was to see that the law is very precise, clear, definite. This is the meaning of term positivism. That is, the law should be positively laid down. That means it should be distinctly, correctly, precisely laid down. Hart, Professor H.L.A. Hart has given the meaning of positivism. First he says the meaning denotes, as I said, it denotes specificity or definite of law. Definite law, precise law, clear law, specific law. Nothing for the chance. Law means, if suppose we have to identify what is murder, then what are the circumstances of murder, what are the ingredients of murder, what is the punishment, in which court that case will, everything very clearly laid down, nothing to leave for chance, nothing for understanding. The second, they have stated the form of law. Form of law. Previously the form of law was religion, custom, tradition, morality. Here positivists, they are very firm that the form of law would be either commands. Command, the essence of law is command. It may be legislation or any other form, but the essence of law is it should be mandatory. So the form of law was legislation or command of the sovereign or the will of the sovereign, whatever. This is the characteristic or the meaning of positivism. The third, every legal concept has to be analyzed. Every legal concept, nothing to be taken for granted. Every legal concept to be analyzed. This is the classic feature of positivism. Nothing to be taken for granted, like it was taken for granted in the natural law theory. The law is based upon the religion. The tenets of the religion could never be analyzed. But here, why murder is classified like this? What are the ingredients of murder? What would be the punishment of the murder, or what is marriage, then what is divorce, what is maintenance, which marriage is legal, which is voidable, whatever. Every aspect has to be clearly stated. That is called as analysis. The civil case would go in which court, the criminal case would go in which court, it would be tried by first whom, then what is the procedure, everything to be laid down precisely, definitely. There should be no scope for ambiguity. This is the meaning of analysis. So whatever is there in the legal system, each and every concept, minute concept, has to be analyzed. This is the meaning of positivism. Then decisions will be given from a set of predetermined rules. The judges will base their decisions on the set of predetermined rules. Predetermined means which have been made before. What is the classic feature of legislation? Legislation is the source of law. We have three sources of law: custom, precedent, and legislation. Okay, so what is the classic feature of legislation? The classic feature of legislation is that it is always made in a prospective angle. Few legislations are retrospectively applied. That is no question. All the welfare legislations are generally retrospectively applied. I am not talking about the application. When the legislature makes a particular law, he has to foresee all the contingencies, that if these arise, then this is the situation, this is the law. So it is made in the prospective angle. Like precedents are not made in prospective angle. Precedents are made on the facts which are before them. If the facts do not come before the judge, can the judge make a precedent? They are made to apply to the situation which is before them, but legislation is made beforehand in a prospective angle. So the classic feature of legislation is that it is made in a prospective angle to anticipate. Or Machiavelli did not wait for murder to take place, then write down the ingredients of murder. Theft should take place, then write down the ingredients of theft. You have to sit and foresee all the contingencies and draft a legislation like that. So it is what? Then the rules become predetermined. You know before the action takes place. We know the law before the action takes place. So the judges have to apply a set of predetermined rules. Means already the law is made and the judges have to apply that particular law. This is the meaning of the decision should be deduced, should be made on a set of predetermined rules. Then this is again a classic feature, that is laws completely separated from the sphere of religion and morals. Complete separation of law from religions and moral. So we have law, a separate entity, identity of law, a form of law came into existence because of positivism. Because they said law, morality, religion, philosophy, ethics, each have got a separate sphere. So law on its own has got some entity and it should not be mingled or mixed with religion or morality. Then law should be always in the is form. Is form. Here there is no scope for a priori method, values which cannot be examined or analyzed, because values have already been analyzed. So this a priori method which was there in the natural law, it has got no place in positivism, and there they used to speak the law is in ought form. Ought form means what? Ought form means if A has committed murder, then A ought to be punished. Positive is certain, no? Specific, definite, no? So if A has committed murder, he is punished with death sentence, life imprisonment, whatever. The word is. So law is studied, analyzed, prevails as it is, not what it ought to be. So the law is in the is form, as it exists, is form. Natural law, it prevails in the ought form. Positivism, it prevails in the is form. This is the meaning of positivism. Now we try to analyze one by one the scholars who have applied these to some extent and analyzed the law for us. We will take first John Austin. Though he has come second in number, I will like to take him before, because his theory is very short and simple. So John Austin, I told you, he is wrongly called as the father of jurisprudence according to Dias. If anybody wants to be called father of jurisprudence, it is Jeremy Bentham and not John Austin. John Austin's work was published first, and in 1945 almost, Bentham's work was published. His work, Austin's work was published long back. That is why. But whatever, we'll study very short, very simple. And when I draw analogies or when I compare, it becomes easy for me to compare Bentham with Austin. So John Austin, for him, he said everything has to be analyzed. So he starts with the basic aspect. That is, he says first what the law should be. So for him, the law has to have a mandatory issue, or it has to be mandatory in nature. For him, like Hobbes, they were both of this, that the sovereign should be all powerful. The sovereign should be all powerful. So he begins his theory saying that the form of law is in commands. Basically, the form of law. Only commands, nothing else. So command means it is something binding, something mandatory, something which is the person is under obligation to obey. Then he says there has to be a source of law, that is the origin of law. Source of law, or the origin from where the law springs out. The form of law is command, and then this presupposes that there should be somebody to command. That is why the source of law. The source of law, he says, is no other than sovereign. The source of law should be originating from a sovereign. That means there is a sovereign who is all powerful, whose authority cannot be challenged, and he will make a law, and that law will be in the form of command. This is what John Austin says. Now, for sovereign, who is a sovereign? So, for him, he says this sovereign has to be a determinate human superior. Determinate human superior. Determinate human superior means that particular superior which can be identified. The word is determined. The name of the book was Austin's The Province of Jurisprudence Determined. I will just tell you this a little later. So this is positivism. Determination, determine, limits. They will use these words. So he wants a determinate human superior. So who would be a sovereign? A determinate human superior. And this particular determinate human superior, he is in the habit of receiving habitual obedience. Habitual obedience. This determinate human superior, he, see the word, he is in the habit of receiving habitual obedience. Means it is his habit to receive obedience, and that habit is also habitual. Means the obedience also has to be habitual. So he is in the habit of receiving habitual obedience. From whom? From a given bulk of the society. He receives the habitual obedience from whom? He receives obedience, but somebody has to obey him, no? So it is from a bulk of the society. Bulk of the society. So he is a determinate human superior who receives habitual obedience from the given bulk of the society. Bulk of the society means the majority of the society. Bulk is what? Small? No. Bulk means the majority of the society. This is sovereign of John Austin. And further, he means who? The sovereign. Sovereign is not in the habit of obeying a like sovereign. He is not in the habit of obeying like sovereign. Obeying a like sovereign. So he is in the habit of receiving obedience. However, he is not in the habit of obeying a like superior or a like sovereign. Like that means there is no other person who is superior as he is, because if this would have happened, then he would have to obey somebody else. The moment the sovereign obeys somebody else, he ceases to be a sovereign. Have you followed? So this is sovereign for John Austin. That is, he has to be, you should be able to locate, identify, and he should be a political superior. He should be a political superior. This means that the law is made by man. This means law is made by man. It is not made by God. This I tell you when he gives the scope of jurisprudence. So it is made by man, a determinative, who is politically strong, who is politically identified, easily determined, and he receives habitual obedience from the society, majority of the society, and he is not in the habit of obeying anybody. So Dias says there are two aspects of sovereignty of John Austin. One is that he receives, this is the positive aspect, that he receives something, obedience, and this is the negative mark or the negative aspect, that is he is not in the habit of obeying a like superior. Obeying a like superior. So these are the two aspects of sovereignty as far as John Austin is concerned. One is positive, he receives habitual obedience. The other, the negative aspect, that he doesn't obey to any like superior. He is the be all and the end all in his particular state. This is the sovereign. Now let us see the meaning of now let us see the attributes of sovereignty. He has stated a few attributes of sovereignty. The first one is, attributes means we can say characteristics or whatever. So the first attribute is that the sovereign is illimitable. Attributes of sovereignty: he is illimitable. The first attribute, the word is illimitable. Limitless powers. Now that is their style of writing, illimitable. So we also use the word illimitable. That means all powerful, no limits. The sovereign doesn't know limits. Why he doesn't know limits? Because he is not in the habit of obeying any like superior. The moment he obeys, his sovereignty is gone. Limitless. This comes from, he studied the English law and to some extent the Roman law. So from their ideology this comes, wherein the maxim prevailed, king can do no wrong. Why king can do no wrong? Because he was always above the law. He was always above the law. So when we want to understand whether we have done legal or illegal, we have a parameter of law, no? Then we know whether our action is legal or it is illegal. This is the parameter of law. So whether our action is within the Indian Penal Code or outside it, we have to have some parameter to test. But when there is absence of parameter, how can you test whether the action is legal or illegal? So the king was, it was like that. The god, he sent the messenger. King was always called as the messenger of the god. Then he had to administer the law, and then there were the subjects. So the king was always above the law in the Western countries. So this is not in the traditional legal system. It was different. But here, so the king was always above the law. So there is no law to test the king's action whether it is right or wrong. And that is why the king was supposed to be above the law. There was nothing that the king could do wrong, because the maxim, king can do no wrong, the maxim prevailed. The maxim prevailed till the year 1947. Till 1947 we got independence, they also got, because the king was the first time he was subjected to tortious and criminal liability by Crown's Proceedings Act, because proceedings could be attributed to crown servants. Crown means crown servants. Because of this, he has got no limits. So the sovereign's authority is wholesome, just like Hobbes. It is wholesome. His power could not be limited by anything, because there was nothing about the sovereign. So it is limitless authority, limitless power enjoyed by the sovereign. The second one is indivisible. indivisible. The sovereignty, the attribute of sovereignty was not that it was illimitable, but it is also indivisible. Indivisible means his authority could not be divided. Like we have divided our authority, the state, we have a legislature, we have an executive, we have the judiciary. So everybody's authority is divided. But here the authority was not divided. The authority is not divided. Why it is not divided? Because if you divide, then who will obey whom? They will become co-sovereigns, and then one will have to obey the other. No. So he speaks about the power which is supreme, which is not limited and which is not divisible. So no center state and no parts. He can have subordinates, but he cannot have co-sovereigns or co-superiors. He cannot, sovereign cannot have this according to John Sovereign. So his power is indivisible. So very rigid concept of sovereignty. It is not flexible, it is a rigid concept of sovereignty. Then continuous. Sovereignty has to be continuous. No gap between sovereignty. Suppose one sovereign ceases, immediately his successor has to be appointed. No gap. And this is today also. When the king or the crown or the queen dies, then they say the king is no more, long live the king. They have to say it in one statement. The king is no more, long live the king. Means what? The person is not there, but long live the king means the chair continues. The chair, long live the king means this chair of kingship will continue because a new successor is going to be immediately appointed. So continuity. Sovereignty has, obviously sovereignty cannot have a break or a gap. So these are the three attributes of the sovereign. Sovereign is the source from where the law originates. So he makes the law, he promulgates the commands. So the next aspect of law is that when the sovereign is determined, then he will make the law, and the form of the law is what? In commands, as we have said before. So now let us see what is this concept of command of John Sovereign. So sovereignty, command. Command means just like orders. Command means they are not directions, they are not directives, they are commands. They are commands. These commands, the first aspect of command is that these commands impose a nature or issue of mandatoriness. That means the person is under compulsion to obey the command. When we say command, you obviously understand that it has to be obeyed. At no cost the person can disobey. So the mandatoriness or the imperativeness is reflected in the word command itself. He doesn't say law, he says command. So the imperativeness is there within the command word itself. The essence of command is imperativeness. That is why K.C. Allen calls Austin's theory as imperative theory of law. He calls it as imperative theory of law. Austin's theory is known by many names. It is known as Austin's theory, it is known as analytical theory, it is known as the theory of commands, it is known as imperative theory. So it means it is John Austin, because Allen has not formulated any theory, but he has commented like Dias. So he says he calls it as imperative theory, because the imperativeness is mandatory, or it is inherent in the essence of the word command. The second is this, that commands which are laws, they are of general nature. That means personal commands are excluded from being laws. If the king says, I am hungry, give me food, so now this becomes a law for the whole state, all the subjects? No, it is a personal command. So the general commands, the commands which have got a general nature, they are only supposed to be laws, and personal commands are to be excluded from it, isn't it? That is but natural. Now what happened was, there was a question asked to Austin, and the question was this, that the question was this, that this is sovereign one. He rules from the year whatever. So he rules from the year 2015 to say 2019, and 2000 May the sovereign ceases, but in his tenure he has made 10 commands. Now the attribute of the sovereignty is that it has to be continuous. So immediately another sovereign too is appointed, say in June 2019. Now when he comes to the throne, the question was asked, what about these 10 commands which are already made by sovereign number 1 in his tenure? Should he erase them and start from making, or should he follow them because this is how the state functions, so they will be needed? So is he to follow the same commands? Because if he follows, then he is obeying the like superior, and if he has to waste time in making all the commands, then also it is the loss of the state. Then what is to be done? So the answer which was given by John Austin was, he continues. So he makes 11 command and he continues the above commands. But then the ones which he has continued from the former sovereign, he doesn't call them commands, he calls them as tacit commands. Tacit command. So what is a tacit command? Tacit command means the commands which are made by the previous sovereign. The commands which are made by the previous sovereign and are accepted, acknowledged and followed by the present sovereign. The commands which are made by the previous sovereign are accepted, acknowledged and followed by the present sovereign is called as tacit command. So he came up with this concept of tacit command to answer the question. So this is how the aspect of tacit command came. So they are inherently mandatory, they have to be of general nature, and command include the concept of tacit command. Tacit command means the commands which are made followed. No, what is tacit command? Very difficult otherwise. So from the commands which are made by the previous sovereign, which are accepted, followed by the present sovereign, they are called as the tacit command. The third aspect of law according to John Austin is sanction. This is the first, this is the second command, and the third is the sanction. Sanction means punishment. Punishment inclusive of civil remedies. In previously, the number of civil remedies were not identified, and it was only criminal punishments which are attributed. Later on, there was bifurcation of civil laws and the criminal laws. So sanction means forms of punishment. So Austin says punishment has to be there. It is must. It is absolutely must for law to have punishment, because the people will obey, the society will obey the sovereign only and only because of the fear of sanction. So he says it is must. It is must. He doesn't accept any other reason for obeying law except the fear of punishment. This is what John Austin says regarding his law. So what is law for John Austin? It is based upon a triangle, wherein as the triangle cannot be completed without three sides, John Austin's concept of law also cannot be completed without three angles. That is the sovereign. He makes the law in the form of commands, and they have to be backed by sanction. Backed by sanction means a person has to do this. If he does not do this, this is the punishment. This is what he says, that the law is in the form of commands and it has to be backed by sanction. That means sanction means the command itself is imperative, but backing it by sanction, it makes it more imperative that if you do not do this, you are subjected to punishment. And it is the fear of punishment which makes the people obey the sovereign, so he can retain his sovereignty. This is the theory of law according to John Austin. Very simple theory. Now we will go to what he says about jurisprudence. Actually, he started his theory with identifying the scope of jurisprudence. He wanted to identify the scope of jurisprudence. For him, he says this is all chaos, whatever everything and anything is falling in the scope of jurisprudence. He says no, it is not like that. So let us determine. So his book's name also is The Province of Jurisprudence Determined. So we can understand his determination in limiting the scope of jurisprudence or identifying the scope of jurisprudence. So he says it can be divided into two. So laws or jurisprudence. He says jurisprudence is the study of law. So he says laws can be divided. Basically, there are two criteria of law. What are the two criteria of law? He says those laws which are so properly called. So laws which are so properly called. The other part, the laws which are not so properly called. Not so properly called. So it divides the law into two classifications. Laws which are so properly called. So properly called means exactly, accurately called as laws. In this also he says there are two types. What are the two types? He says laws which are so strictly called. Laws which are so strictly called. Laws which are so strictly called. From properly, so strictly called, and laws which are not so strictly called. In this laws which are so strictly called, he says that we have those laws which are called as the divine law. That is law coming from the nature. And the other part, which are, there are two parts. One is that the laws which are made by political superior to political inferior. Political superior and political inferior. Those laws which are based or made by a person who is political superior to a person who is politically inferior. The other part, he says over here, is that those laws which are made or based upon legal obligation. Legal obligation. Legal obligation means the tenant has to pay the rent to the owner. It is based upon legal obligation. So legal obligation is also a type of law which is which falls in the group of strict laws, or those laws which are strict laws. This is the classification of laws so strictly called. Now laws not so strictly called, he says, are those laws which are based upon, say, pursuance. That is, he says, it can be positive, the word which he uses is positive morality. Pursuance means he does it, so you do it. Or actually positive morality means there is some sort of persuasive value according to the customs. That means suppose there is a particular marriage, then we attend that particular marriage because it is obligatory, it is our moral duty to attend it, and everybody does it, so it becomes a positive morality, the notion of positive morality. Have you followed this? Now, what is laws so not properly called? Laws so not properly called include, first of all, laws which are made by fashion. Fashion, laws which are based upon fashion, because we have to suit that particular age or time, because the law is prevailing in a particular state. Then it, like for example, human rights, then human rights will be a fashion which is all the states follow the same convention, so it becomes like a fashion. Then the laws which are made by metaphor or analogy, metaphor or analogy, laws which are made by metaphor or analogy. Metaphor means it is a figure of speech. Comparison is made without using the words as and like. So similarly, in this state a particular situation arises, and in another state the same situation arises, then we make a law in the second state by analogy, that here the things prevail over here, the same things prevail over here, so we also have the same type of law. Many laws are made by analogy. And the third over here, he calls laws not so properly called, is the international law. He says international law is no law, because it falls in the group of laws not so properly called. Then now what is the scope of jurisprudence? He says the scope of jurisprudence is that part of law so properly called, which includes laws so strictly called, which are made by political superior to political inferior only. The rest all falls outside the scope of jurisprudence. So what is the scope of jurisprudence? Those laws which are made by political superior to political inferior, which are part of laws which are made by man, and this is the divine law. These are the laws made by man. That man has to be political superior to political inferior. Divine law, natural law, these are the laws which are made by man, and man also two types. One is political superior to political inferior, and the other is based upon legal obligation, but the legal obligation is out. Now only this part, that is laws which are made by political superior to political inferior, is the scope of jurisprudence. So he leaves everything outside it, the natural law, the divine law, all international law, then laws based upon positive morality, metaphor, analogy, fashion, everything is outside. Only this is the focus. So his theory is only regarding that. The only three aspects of the theory: sovereignty, command, sanction, and the theory is over. So now let us see what are the merits and demerits of John Austin's theory. What would be the merits of John Austin's theory? The first and the foremost merit is that for the first time it was published that the law could be analyzed. So the concept of analysis owes its origin to John Austin, because it was for the first time given. Yes, very well. His theory is also called as the analytical theory. All positivists have analyzed, but because Austin's theory was first published, it is called as the analytical theory. It is analytical theory. He has said, at least he has tried to identify the source of law. He has stated that there would be a determinate, that is, law would be made by person, that is a sovereign, though the characteristics of the sovereign may not be good, but at least he has identified the source of sovereign. He has given a form of law, command. He has given a form of law. That form of law was missing. He has tried to separate law from morals. The fourth, he has tried to separate laws from morals. He has given a separate entity or identity to laws. He has given a separate entity or identity to the laws. He has separated laws. So it is a very good merit of John Austin. Then it is true that to some extent the fear of punishment makes the people obey the law. But the word is to some extent. It is true to some extent that the fear of punishment really works. It helps the sovereign to implement or execute the law. This is the merit of John Austin. But the first and foremost merit is that he has for the first time analyzed the attributes of law, that there would be a law, that there would be the validity of law, he speaks about the when would the law be valid. The law would be valid only if it is made by a sovereign in the form of command and backed by sanction. So he for the first time speaks about the validity of law. Otherwise, in natural law, there was no question, because every law which is made by God is valid. As long it is made by God, it is valid. We could not analyze whether it is valid or not valid, because we could not analyze the concepts of religion. So he for the first time speaks about the validity of law. Demerits, number of demerits. The first one is that the attributes of the sovereign not in consonance with today's times. Nobody would like a sovereign to be all powerful, limitless. Today we don't have the concept of limitless sovereign at all. The power of sovereign is determined and it is limited. It is determined, as he says, but it is also limited. There is no question of having indivisible power, because we believe in dividing the power, because absolute power corrupts. Absolutely, the inherent risk of power is corruption, and so we believe in the division. So this is another very severe demerit. The other demerit is command. Laws, every law cannot be in the form of command. Some are directions. All have to go to the criminal court for the criminal pursuit of criminal actions. But if we don't have, then so certain laws are directives. Every law cannot be command. And his Professor Hart, he doesn't accept his concept of tacit command. He says you call it tacit command, you call it whatever. The moment, if according to his own analysis of sovereignty, the moment you accept somebody else's command, then the sovereignty ceases, no? So it is a way out, according to Professor H.L.A. Hart. He doesn't accept his command. The next aspect of demerit is that sanctions. Every law cannot be obeyed by just the fear of sanction. It is not correct to say that each and every person of the society will obey the law just because of the fear of sanction. Another demerit is this, that he has limited the scope of jurisprudence to a very large extent. We will like to broaden the scope or reduce the scope. He has reduced the scope to a very small, that is only those laws which are so strictly called, which are made by political superior to political inferior. So that is all in the scope of jurisprudence. The other severe demerit is that he does not recognize international law. He does not recognize international law as law at all. He puts it in the group of laws not so properly called. So this is a very severe demerit. Another severe demerit is that he could not apply his theory even to England, because he could not identify who would be the real sovereign, whether it is parliament, whether it is crown, whether it is crown in parliament. So these issues were prevailing, and so he could not apply his theory even to England. His theory is a little rigid and it gives a very strict interpretation of law. There is no flexibility in the theory. This is this and that is all. This is the law, that is all. And the last demerit, he has paid a lip service. These are Dias's words. He has paid lip service to general jurisprudence. So he has paid lip service to general jurisprudence. General jurisprudence means when a theory is formulated, the application of the theory should be in general to all the states of the universe. This is called as general jurisprudence. He accepted that. He said that yes, when a theory is formulated, it has to be, you can't have a theory which is applicable only to a very limited or a very small group of the state. So he said yes, theory should be of general, it is called as general jurisprudence. However, he only said it by his lips, but when it came to formulation of the theory, it was not general jurisprudence. So now let us see the application of the theory marks the merit of the theory. The more the application, the more useful, the more fruitful the theory is. So what would be the application of John Austin's theory? whenever the law is strictly interpreted by the Supreme Court judges, we say austin in opinion. The law is austin in opinion. So wherever the law is very strictly interpreted, like say in A.K. Gopalan, A.K. Gopalan, very strict interpretation of law. Then Article 299, all those cases, Kasturi Lal, Vidyavati, Thangarajan, all those cases wherein very strict interpretation of law is given. That means when the Supreme Court does not adopt flexibility, we say Austin's theory, Austin in opinion. So when a person is strict, they are called as having Austin in opinion. This is Austin's theory, the application of Austin's theory. N number of cases where the law was strictly interpreted by the Supreme Court. I don't have to list out the cases, but there are so many case laws where the Supreme Court has given a very strict interpretation.